All right. Hey, everybody. Good morning, good technically afternoon, depending on where you are at. Welcome to the latest edition of FSMA Fridays. Really excited to have you all join us yet again. And this is the February 2019 edition and have lots of good stuff to share. So thanks for joining us. We're going to dig right in because we got a lot of content to get to. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, we'd like to say thank you and welcome. We're excited to see this community continue to grow and build. And this is the longest standing industry update that we're really proud of. I think we're going on our 6th year here. And so we try and touch on FSMA related news, regulation changes, some of the updates, trends and best practices we're seeing out in the field. And probably one of the most valuable parts is the opportunity to do Q&A with our expert guests from the Acheson Group. And speaking of them, we have partnered with TAG to put this on over the last 5-6 years here. Partnership we're very proud of and is proven to be really valuable for a lot of our clients as well. So we want to continue to thank TAG for being part of this. And this is something that, again, we are committed to continuing to bring on as long as all of you are seeing some value and continue to grow and keep the audience coming. So kind of what's in store for today, a few things. One is we try and keep these pretty conversational. So we're going to go through a little bit of an update around FSMA and then dig into a little more of a training topic, if you will, and we'll follow that up with Q&A. Want to encourage you to ask questions. You will typically save those questions for the end, but I'll be monitoring those on the back end here. But you'll notice that only the panelists, myself and Eric, are listed in the display panel, so you don't have to worry about your question being kind of pushed out to everybody. We also are always recording these. We actually host a really nice, big, huge library on our site at SafetyChain. You can also find all of the past FSMA Fridays. I don't know if anyone knows this, but you can find all of them on YouTube. Last but not least, if you have any technology issues with the GoToWebinar system, we have our friend Ann standing by on the back end here, keeping an eye on stuff, and she can try and help you if you want to fire away anything into the chat box to her. If not, send your questions using the question box. Pretty straightforward stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the man of the hour, one of our favorites coming back here, Eric Edmunds. He's the Food Safety Director over at the Acheson Group. And so welcome, Eric. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, see, once you got into the rotation, I warned you, you start getting all these people showing up. We're going to keep bringing you back. So we're excited to have you. And so let's start first, Eric, and dig into anything on the news front. I know you were talking a little bit about some things Congress was working on around water. And so what have you guys been hearing on the regulatory front?
Yeah, overall, there haven't been a lot of developments in terms of FDA in regard to FSMA, but as most people know, some of the major food safety issues from last year, well, one of the most major ones that affected quite a few people was the issues with leafy greens and romaine lettuce.
Right.
And after some of the FDA investigations, some of those issues seem to have been caused by water quality, and the quality of water used in produce areas, whether it was sanitized properly on farm or whether it was derived from a reservoir that may have been close to a confined animal feeding operation. And that was one of the aspects of the produce safety rule that has been delayed due to the complexity and difficulty of following and implementing those standards. And with that being one of the sources of the contamination in these romaine lettuce issues, you've seen some movement in Congress, and they obviously have a lot of say, and we're the ones who originally passed FSMA, that
Sure.
A lot of them don't really agree with the delayed implementation deadlines for water quality standards and testing and the produce safety rule. So they've written some letters to the FDA asking for quicker compliance timelines, quicker implementation. FDA hasn't necessarily responded publicly to any of that, but it is something to be watching for as it's become one of those things in those high-risk foods that is definitely affecting the quality and safety of the food that they're producing. So something to watch to see how FDA responds to that, and if those compliance deadlines and implementation timelines change. Haven't had any direct input to say they will change. They'll still likely be delayed, but that's been a focus of Congress, trying to get FDA to move a little quicker in that regard.
Got it. Yeah, there's been other complications there, I'm sure, that have added to that, which we won't get into, but that's good to know. And I know for our customers, I mean, it's a hot topic, particularly for, we're on the West Coast here, so a lot of our customers in the ag space, this is something that's very top of mind. We're seeing as we get into trade show season, this is a topic we're seeing a lot on the list to cover. So we'll keep an eye on that. So thanks for that update. And then today, I think we were going to take a bit of a deeper dive. And one of the things I wanted to share with folks, we're working with TAG on trying to evolve this series, right? So we started this series focused a lot on just FSMA, and one of the things we're looking to do this year to continue to add more value is expand it. So we're going to experiment a little bit from just a FSMA focus on some of these deeper dive topics with the TAG experts to maybe something a little broader along the lines of an FSQA focus. And so today, Eric, I think what we were going to dig into a little bit is the bioengineered food disclosure. And I know there's a lot of dates and a lot of information, and so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you share what you got here.
Yeah, sounds great. This is definitely not a direct FSMA topic, although it really affects everyone who is affected by FSMA. They're the same, especially because it's applicable mostly and just to foods that are regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that's really what FSMA was in the end. It was an amendment to that and setting up new standards. It's a new standard that's more or less been developed by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services. Has some different type of enforcement issues that we'll get into a little later, but most people would be more familiar with the term GMO, but the way Congress passed this law, they use the term bioengineered food disclosure just to kind of categorize it without using the term GMO. All the details behind that decision are a little complicated and deal with a little bit of politics, but we figured this was a great one to touch on this month because the final rule was published in late December by the USDA and the Agriculture Marketing Service. So technically, any rule that is published by a federal agency comes into effect 60 days after it is published. So that would have been February 19th, actually. However, you notice from this slide that's up today or up on the screen now, the actual compliance deadlines are not for a few years out, and it's kind of an interesting setup where they have both an implementation date, a voluntary compliance date, and a mandatory compliance date. So it's kind of you don't typically see a different implementation date from a compliance date. They're typically the same thing, but the Agriculture Marketing Service, or AMS, has kind of recognized that there's going to be a timeline where companies need to be working to identify which foods would need to have this disclosure that they are a bioengineered food directly, or they are derived from bioengineered foods. And there's a few different standards, but the way they've kind of set it up in the rule is that the implementation date of January 1, 2020 for all food manufacturers other than small food manufacturers is kind of the deadline, or what they're saying is the date upon which the food company should begin or should already be identifying which of their food products will need the disclosure. So want to make sure that people are kind of on top of it and have that year to, or 2 years to really be looking into, these are what the products we produce that will need the disclosure, and then they have the timeline in order to implement and actually get the labels onto the products. So small new food manufacturers is based basically on your annual receipts, and they set the standard of $2.5 million in annual receipts, which they used as a little bit different from some of the other FDA exemptions under FSMA that have the smaller $1 million or $500,000 limits. And they kind of did a determination on that, just deciding how many entities would have been exempt on a smaller annual receipts or annual sales basis, and decided this was the most effective to make sure the information got on the most food products to provide information to the consumer. So the standard doesn't directly affect food safety. It's more or less a transparency issue, so consumers are aware of what they may be eating or the processes upon which the ingredients were derived or brought into the food. And so that first date is just kind of the set deadline for determining which foods will need the label. And then you have some time for voluntary compliance, because they recognize there are lots of companies out there that are willing and ready to kind of implement the labels prior to the actual mandatory compliance deadline. So starting even now, you'll start seeing some foods declaring whether it's bioengineered or GMO, and this rule will set up a nationwide standard, so all foods will be following the same idea, and consumers will be seeing the same types of notifications and disclosures on the food products for easier understanding. And that's just kind of how they've set that up in a regard to make sure everything is being labeled by January 1st of 2022. So the voluntary compliance deadline is just that opportunity where you'll start seeing it, and that's kind of the deadline of the December 31st, 2021 is when it no longer is voluntary and will be mandatory. As far as the compliance deadlines, there's some parameters set up where companies are allowed to use labels that they've already printed and have in their inventories until that January 1st, 2022 deadline. And there's some provisions that allow them to add additional stickers if they're not covering up other pertinent information for the label and things like that. But by that January 2022, all food products that are being labeled should be following the kind of three main disclosure methods that are prescribed in the rule. So just as a general overview, and kind of how I said, this is promulgated by the USDA marketing services, but it really just applies to foods that are covered by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is typically under FDA purview. And there's some difficulties in that and addressing exactly how it's sourced and things. So the real disclosure is required whenever the food is bioengineered or contains bioengineered ingredients, and whether that the DNA is detectable within the food, which I'll touch on briefly on the next slide. But so the little tricky part is, so the typical regulations that apply to USDA food products, the Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Product Inspection and Egg Product Inspection Act, are not required to label unless they are combined with other food ingredients or foods that would be covered by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that's listed there. So the predominant ingredient, imagine a chicken Caesar salad, but being that the lettuce is the predominant ingredient, although it does contain a food that would be regulated by the Poultry Product Inspection Act, the predominant ingredient would be the leafy greens and any other items or dressings that are combined in that would be covered. And the other one being the predominant ingredient being broth, stock, or other solutions. And the second most predominant ingredient is also subject to the FDA Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So looking at that, it's kind of the chicken noodle soup. If the ingredient list has chicken noodle soup, so broth is going to be the main component, but if there are more noodles than chicken, it is subject to the Bioengineered Food Disclosure Act. But if there's more chicken than noodles, and so it would be broth, chicken noodles on the ingredient list. It would not be covered by the Food Disclosure Act or Food Disclosure Standards. So a little bit of a nuance there, but something to look out for and be aware of for food manufacturers in determining their product formulations and whether they are required to follow and disclose whether the food contains or is derived from bioengineered food ingredients. So they put out a fairly direct definition of what a bioengineered food means, and it gets a little scientific, so I won't delve into it too much, but contains detectable genetic material that has been modified through in vitro recombinant rDNA techniques that could not have been found through conventional breeding found in nature. So typical breeding techniques that may just be cross hybridization and things like that. The bioengineered food standard also doesn't really address exactly the sciences that are used. It focuses purely on the final result of the food product from the breeding techniques or standards and things that are used. So in vitro really means kind of in a tube, kind of test tube type of thing, not something that would occur naturally. And that's the standard that they're using. So you'll see that it's a little bit of a different standard, and Europe has kind of gone a little bit of a different direction in the sense that they are addressing specific scientific methods, but the AMS I recognize that new technologies are going to be continuously developed, and they don't want to focus on those because they really aren't, I guess you could say, nimble enough on their feet to amend and adapt the regulation on a quick basis every time a new science or technology comes out. So they're looking more at the final food product rather than the exact science or method that is used to get the final food product. One aspect that I guess I skipped over is these disclosures that are required are either going to be required to be on the principal display panel of the food. Otherwise, they can also be located next to the name and address of the manufacturer on the ingredient panel or additional information panel. And in some cases, when there's just not enough space to include the disclosure in either of those areas, there is a permissibility to allow the disclosure on another panel, although that would be in rare circumstances when there's just not enough spaces on the principal display panel or information panel next to the manufacturer's name and address or distributor's name and address. And being that standard of detectable in food, that is that idea that lots of foods out there, for example, soy is an item that is regularly a bioengineered food in the US, but it is often refined into an oil or other product that could be used in an ingredient, that the actual DNA that has been modified through these different techniques that may render the food to be a bioengineered food or an ingredient, it's kind of set up so there's literally no DNA left in the food to evaluate on a scientific level that the food actually is a bioengineered food or not. So there's a variety of ways that they have set up that companies can basically keep records to demonstrate to the AMS that it is not detectable or has been sourced from a supplier that doesn't have any GMO or bioengineered product. There are some areas where it kind of comes in that there's always going to be a potential for minor aspects of a bioengineered food to be contained in it. Examples being through harvest and processing strategies where a food manufacturer may be processing a bioengineered ingredient or a soybean one day and a non-bioengineered the next day, or they're harvested in fields that are next to each other, that one's bioengineered and one's not. There are some prescriptions that allow small amounts of bioengineered foods to be contained as long as they meet certain thresholds that, which is kind of a 5% standard that they've set up per ingredient. But through these processes, the companies can either have validated refining processes that show that there's no detectable DNA. They can keep records showing that they have secure and great supplier programs guaranteeing that the supplier is only providing non-GMO or non-bioengineered foods. And within the rule, they've also set up some laboratory standards to set up a reliability consistency issue on the tests that are being conducted. So there are always some exemptions to rules, and the kind of the big one for this is that restaurants and similar retail establishments, so bars, cafeterias, and everything, they don't have a, they are not required to disclose when they're using bioengineered ingredients. And that one that's listed there with inadvertent or technical allowance for up to 5% of each ingredient for areas in which it's just almost impossible to guarantee with 100% certainty that there's 0% bioengineered ingredient due to harvesting or processing practices that come about, as well as food derived from an animal when the animal has consumed bioengineered feed. The corns, canolas, soys, and things that are often used in animal feed will not render that food to need a disclosure on it, as well as food that is certified under the National Organic Program. They've clarified that any food that has the labels made with organic ingredients, there are standards set up within the National Organic Program that basically already guarantee that there's very minimal or no bioengineered food or ingredients in those products. So those are some of the exemptions they have. One thing that restaurants and similar retail establishments, oftentimes grocery stores are included in those, but this rule doesn't include them the same way due to the fact that grocery stores often sell bulk ingredients that don't have any sort of label on them. And in those instances, the grocery stores are not exempt from the rule, and they will be required to put the disclosure on kind of where they would typically keep their nutrition information on bulk ingredients that consumers may buy in a grocery store. So I mentioned that they focused on the actual foods and not the scientific processes for which the foods are derived. So this is the list as it exists now. These are not foods that are only available in the United States. Some of these are not allowed in commerce in the United States, but this is the specific list of foods that they have identified that exist in the world today. Obviously, you know, the world's getting flat in terms of sourcing. And so companies have to be aware that they may be getting some of these ingredients from other countries. A good example being the eggplant listed there that is more commonly grown in Southeast Asia and not in the United States, as well as a few of those others. That it's basically a list that says, heads up, if you're using any of these products, you really need to have your supplier programs down to make sure you're not accepting any of the bioengineered aspects of these and failing to make the mandatory and appropriate disclosures to the consumer. They're going to go through this list on a yearly basis to try to update it as well as they can, but just because a food isn't listed here doesn't mean you're in the clear. You still have to look into your sourcing and supplier list to make sure that some additional food isn't added in the interim year before the AMS gets to updating this list, and it will always be the responsibility of the manufacturer to ensure that their supplier sources are not including bioengineered food disclosure or bioengineered foods without maintaining the appropriate consumer disclosure. So these are the options, the main options by which the AMS is kind of delineated for disclosing to the consumer. I have the two images down there, one being derived from bioengineering and bioengineered or bioengineered for the options of being one food that is solely bioengineered, like a corn, versus the food that may contain corn that is bioengineered, and those are the options for that. The two additional options are a little different, and they're going to be doing some additional research into seeing if these adequately provide consumers with the disclosure that would be needed, mostly due to the fact that some of these require a smartphone for scanning for more information. That's why they've added them must be accompanied by a phone number as well, or text messages, specifically how the consumer can get additional information on exactly what ingredients may or may not be bioengineered in a packaged food product. Both of the electronic links and text messages have to kind of address to a phone number or a website or a text response that is available 24/7 and provides the exact information to the consumer, who may use those sources when there isn't an immediate symbol on the food product. With this, they've also, through the original proposal and how it exists now, they have gotten rid of the option for companies to use a may be bioengineered or may be derived from bioengineering when they're not quite sure. They want the manufacturers to really do their research and know exactly what they're putting into their food products as ingredients. As far as enforcement, this kind of falls along the same lines as the Foreign Supplier Verification Program of FSMA. It's a document review. So those records you have, whether you're keeping certificates of analysis or have validated refinement processes to where it wouldn't contain any detectable bioengineered ingredients, the AMS will be looking into things, and there's the option that they may say, can you provide me all your records on this food product? Or they may say, we need to come on site and look into your records personally to verify that you are making the appropriate disclosure. There's also this aspect, and there's some prescribed aspects of that where any interested person can basically write a complaint to AMS, and AMS will evaluate that complaint and then determine if they're going to open up an investigation into the record reviews of a company to ensure that appropriate disclosures are being made. So in general, that was kind of it in a nutshell. I know we kind of went through it, and it is a lot of information, but in general, the idea is that if you have a food that's on that list or that may contain bioengineered foods, you have to make the disclosure, and it's a thorough record keeping and sourcing process to verify and validate that you are not selling a food that contains or is derived from bioengineered ingredients that needs to be disclosed to the consumer for a transparent issue, so consumers are more aware of what they may be purchasing.
Very good. Lots of moving parts there, but and as always, you timed it perfectly. Like a lot of times, Eric, with these types of topics, some of the questions coming up are pretty specific, but we've got a couple minutes, and so I'm going to these are really more about, how does this rule apply? If you're, as always, with these types of things, what we encourage you to do is reach out to TAG directly, but I'll touch on a couple of these, and Eric, if you have the answer, great. If not, then we can always take these offline too. Does that work for you?
That sounds great.
Okay. So the first one is asking about, does this cover meat from tissue culture?
The rule doesn't necessarily speak directly to that at that point. I think that's one of those aspects where, without it being commercially available at the moment, they don't have the information to include it on that list of bioengineered foods. But it definitely could, depending on the final product. It won't necessarily depend on the process by which it's derived. It will depend on the actual genetics in the final product.
Right. Okay. And that list is going to be a fluid document too, like you said, so something to watch. So thanks, Lori, for that question. Donna had a question about, do you have any background on the bioengineered status of citric acid?
I do not.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, I knew some of these were really specific, so that's okay. We're going to go through the... And then the last one from Mike is also about meat and protein, but he's asking specifically, where do meat and protein analogs fall?
That's going to be right into that. So the analogs being more or less the products that aren't necessarily meat but are made to represent that. It depends on your sourcing. So if you're from a soy ingredient that the analog does have the whole soy, it may or may not contain genetic material. You'll notice that it's not listed on the area right now, but for like a soy burger or something like that, you'd be looking into the fact of whether that soy is processed through the production area to have no detectable genetic material or not.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, that's a emerging, really interesting market. So interesting to see how that's going to play with all of this. Eric, this was fantastic. I think there's going to be a lot of questions that are come as any of these new regs come down. So one of the places we try and keep you all updated is on our LinkedIn group. So we have one for FSMA Fridays. So while you're on your computer now, if you're not already part of that group, go on over, hit the request button to join the group, and we'll make sure and get you in. We share any of the post-session questions and Q&A that we cover, links to anything we mentioned, including the deck and recording there. So make sure you join us there. And one of the things that we always like to make sure, one of the greatest resources you have is Eric and his team over at the Acheson Group. So, you know, again, some of these questions get really detailed, as they should be, and every company, as we know, is so different. And this is what they do and what they do well. So whether you're looking to assess the risk around operations or obviously your brand and reputation, regulatory, this is what their team is out there doing. They are growing fast. They have a lot of specialties within their organization. You can see just a handful of those here, and certainly encourage you to reach out to them if you have some specific questions around this topic here today, or obviously anything related particularly to the food safety world there. And on the technology side, you know, Eric mentioned a little bit about, you know, some of the record keeping we have to do and keeping track of what's going on with your supplier list and that sort of thing. And that's where we can step in and help automate and manage and simplify a lot of this for you. So we have a cloud-based system that helps you run all your programs from QA, food safety, supplier compliance, and a whole lot more. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little sneaky guy popping up there on that phone. We have a really, really exciting new tool called Link. That's a business intelligence tool that we are revealing here in the next couple weeks. So stay tuned for that. Something we're really, really excited about sharing more on. The last thing that we want to share that we're really proud and excited. I know some of you had a chance to join this demo day a few months ago when we officially launched this. And we have built a tool together with TAG and their team, the TAG risk assessment tool. And I think this is really appropriate, as Eric mentioned today, the key and the importance of knowing, you know, what is going on with the suppliers and in a, you know, example with bioengineered food, but just the risk in general, right? This is one of the fastest growing risks, and it can be tough to get your hands around. And ultimately the burden's on the manufacturers and the processors. So we have built a tool that combines their proven methodology and our proven technology to really have a robust system for managing and mitigating risk around your suppliers. And the cool thing is, not only does it include all the reporting and the software, but it also includes monthly consulting with the folks over at TAG. So you get the best of both worlds there. Something we're really excited about and starting to see some customers using, and it's going to be really fun to see the impact it makes. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can reach out to either of us at TAG or SafetyChain. We have some information about it listed on our solutions page under our quick start packages, and we'd love to show you a quick demo on how that might be able to help. With that, we'll be sending out a copy of the recording and the deck, and like we mentioned, a couple of demo days coming up here that we're pretty excited about. TAG newsletter is always a must-have, so make sure you grab that on their page at their site, and we will get back together the end of next month. So Eric, thank you again, and appreciate, as always, the support from your friends over there at TAG, and want to thank all of you for making time today, your busy schedules. Hope you found it valuable. Appreciate you, and we'll see you next month.
Sounds great. Thanks, Brian.